I was the only one who visited Grandpa. Then they fought me for his house, like I was a stranger. I pushed the creaking door open and immediately felt my heart tighten. The hallway was dark except for a narrow beam of sunlight sneaking through the dusty front window. Grandpa's old house had always been filled with warmth and the faint scent of sweet tea, but now it felt hollow, as though his absence had sucked out every bit of life that once dwelled within these walls. I stepped inside, nearly stumbling over a pair of unfamiliar shoes left haphazardly by the entry. That was my first sign that something was very wrong. I had locked this place the last time I visited, and no one else was supposed to be here. Yet there I stood, staring at footprints on the dusty floor leading toward Grandpa's old bedroom. My pulse raced, and I wondered who had come in uninvited. When I called out a tentative, "Hello?" my voice seemed to echo in an eerie vacuum. I crept along, passing the family photographs still hanging on the wall, pictures of Grandpa as a young man, of me as a child perched on his knee, of long-forgotten family reunions. The hallway smelled of old wood and stale memories. I noticed one of the framed photos askew, as if someone had bumped it in a hurry. My throat felt tight. I was expecting to come here for some quiet reflection, to remember the man I had loved so dearly. Instead, I was walking into a mystery. Then I heard a noise from the living room, what sounded like an aggravated mutter, followed by the scraping of a chair. Without thinking, I rushed in. There he was, my cousin Terry, whom I hadn't seen in over a year, rifling through Grandpa's documents on the coffee table. He turned around sharply, eyes wide with guilt. The moment he saw me, his expression shifted to a mask of anger. "What are you doing here?" he snarled, like I was some intruder in my own grandfather's house. I bristled. "What do you mean, what am I doing here?" I snapped back. My words bounced off the peeling wallpaper, too loud in the stillness. "This is Grandpa's place." I locked it up. My mind was whirring. Terry hadn't visited Grandpa in ages. He'd always been too busy or too disinterested. Grandpa used to tell me how he hadn't heard from Terry or any of the other relatives for months, even years. Yet here Terry was, rummaging through drawers like he had every right in the world. "He was my grandfather, too," Terry growled, fists tightening. "And let's not pretend you own this place." I wanted to argue, but an icy dread had already begun to pool in my stomach. I knew what he was implying. Everything came crashing back in my mind. Grandpa's illness, the quiet days I'd spent driving him to the doctor, the nights he'd spent telling me stories about how this house had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. Grandpa had been so meticulous about his wishes, so clear that he wanted me to inherit the house. And I knew how it must have looked to everyone else. I was the only one who visited regularly, the only one who showed genuine concern, and so Grandpa had made me the beneficiary in his will. The rest of the family had mostly ignored him for years, but now that he was gone, they were crawling out of the woodwork. I felt a trembling anger rise in my chest. "Terry, I'm only here because Grandpa asked me to look after everything. The will—" But he cut me off. "Yeah, the will. I know about it. I know it says the house goes to you, but we'll see about that. A lot of people think you manipulated him. I sure do." It was jarring to hear him speak as though I were a con artist. There was an ache in my heart that I tried to swallow down. "I never manipulated him," I said more softly. "You know I cared about him, and none of you visited him for years. Where were you when he needed help getting to his doctor's appointments? Where were you when I had to fix the leaky roof so he wouldn't freeze in winter?" Terry had no answer. Instead, he just shoved a stack of old letters into his bag, stepped around me, and muttered something about me not keeping the place for long. Then he stormed out, slamming the door so hard that dust fell from the ceiling. I stood there, my heart pounding, feeling numb. That was when the weight of everything settled on me once more. I had fought so hard to take care of Grandpa in his last days, and now that he was gone, the real fight was just beginning. I sank onto Grandpa's old sofa, where the upholstery had faded from bright green to a dull gray over the decades. Suddenly, the memories rushed back like an unstoppable tide. I remembered being 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on this same sofa with Grandpa telling me stories about how he'd grown up in this house. He told me about the orchard that used to stand behind the backyard fence, about the old swing he'd built for me when I was too small to climb onto it myself. He always smelled faintly of tobacco and peppermint, and his voice was low and warm, the kind of voice that could make any story sound like a grand adventure. My parents weren't around much then. They had their own troubles drifting in and out of our lives. Grandpa had been my anchor. I recalled the weekends I would beg him to let me stay over, the simple breakfast we'd share of toast and jam, the air filled with the morning sun. Over time, as I got older, he became not just a grandfather but a true father figure. So when his health began to fail, it felt natural that I was the one who stayed close, who helped him with prescriptions and appointments. I didn't do it because I wanted this house. I did it because I loved him. But the rest of the family saw it differently, or at least they pretended to. They had largely abandoned him, rarely calling, sending a card once in a blue moon. Yet the moment Grandpa passed, leaving a legal will naming me the beneficiary of the house, they started whispering accusations about how I must have coerced him. It was cruel, unfair, and so deeply hurtful, but it didn't surprise me. I knew my relatives well enough to sense that where money or property was concerned, they were capable of almost anything. I felt overwhelmed by the swirl of emotions as I sat there alone. My cheeks were damp with unexpected tears. I wanted Grandpa back. I wanted the simpler times when none of us had to worry about lawyers or wills or who owned what piece of property. I just wanted to honor Grandpa's memory. But I knew that ignoring the conflict wouldn't make it go away. Terry's threats were just the beginning. I braced myself for the storm that was about to erupt. And sure enough, within a week, I received a formal notice stating that multiple family members intended to contest the will. When I showed this letter to the lawyer Grandpa had recommended, he shook his head grimly and told me we'd better prepare for a battle. In the days that followed, I found myself remembering how it all began, back when Grandpa first started getting sick. I was in college at the time, juggling part-time jobs to keep myself afloat. Grandpa called me one evening, this was before he really deteriorated, and his voice sounded shaky. He said, "I hate to bother you, kiddo, but could you drop by? I'm not feeling quite right, and I could use some help." I immediately left everything and caught the next train to his town. When I arrived, I saw him sitting on the porch, looking thinner than I remembered, wearing the same old cardigan but missing his usual spark. He smiled at me when I came up the steps, but I could tell he was tired. From then on, I visited almost every weekend. Sometimes I'd stay for a day, sometimes for 3 or 4 days if I could manage it. I'd help with household chores, fix leaks, cook simple meals. Mostly, though, I just kept him company. We'd play checkers, watch old Western movies, and he'd talk about life in the old days. He'd weave these intricate stories about how the neighborhood used to be filled with small family-owned shops. He'd talk about how proud he was of me for pursuing my education. One by one, his physical abilities started failing. He couldn't drive anymore, so I took him to the doctor. When he needed surgery on his knee, I stayed with him in the hospital and then helped him through rehab. He never demanded any of it. He was so gracious. Sometimes he worried he was a burden on me, and I'd reassure him that I was doing exactly what I wanted to do, standing by him just as he had stood by me. Meanwhile, I barely saw or heard from the other relatives. They lived in other states or even other countries. They'd pop up on social media, posting about their luxurious trips or new ventures, but they never seemed to have the time to pick up the phone and call Grandpa. He used to put on a brave face about it, saying, "They're busy living their lives. I don't want to be a nuisance." But I could sense the sadness in him, the longing for family that never came. One evening, not too long before he passed, Grandpa sat me down in the living room. He looked at me with watery eyes and said softly, "I've made up my mind, you know, about the house and everything." I had a lump in my throat. I knew he was referring to his final arrangements. He reached over and patted my hand. "I've got the will drawn up. I know not everybody will be happy about it, but this house has been in our family for so long, and you're the only one who's really made it feel like home in recent years. I want you to have it, and I want you to keep it safe. Keep it in the family for as long as you can." I tried to protest. I told him that he should do whatever he thought best, that I didn't need a house to remember him by. I reassured him that whether I inherited a dime or not, I would still be by his side. He smiled and said, "I know, kiddo. That's exactly why it belongs to you." Then he looked off to the side, as if imagining a future where I'd fill these rooms with my own family or my own dreams. The sincerity in his eyes was so raw that I couldn't argue further. When he passed away, it felt like the light in the house dimmed forever. Even the floors seemed to creak more sadly. But I pressed on, organizing the funeral, sorting through Grandpa's affairs. Only then did the rest of my extended family start to materialize. They arrived at the funeral with hushed expressions, offering me half-hearted condolences. But I could already see it in some of their eyes. The unspoken question about the property, the big old family house that might be worth quite a lot if sold to the right developer. At the reading of the will, I saw jaws drop. Grandpa's wishes were clear. I was the primary beneficiary of the house, while any liquid assets were to be split among several others. The tension in that room was thicker than tar. I remember my Aunt Linda's face turning red as she shouted, "That's not fair." Terry stood up, slamming his fist on the table and accusing me of tricking Grandpa. The lawyer calmly explained that the will was properly executed and that Grandpa had full mental capacity when he signed it. But that did nothing to quell the outrage. I saw the greed flicker in their eyes. All these relatives who had scarcely visited Grandpa when he was alive. They looked at me as if I had stolen something from them. It didn't take long for the threats to start pouring in. I got calls at odd hours, voices on the other end cursing me, telling me I was a snake. My phone lit up with messages. How could you do this? You should share the house with us. This isn't over. The tension culminated in those official legal papers contesting the will. They alleged I had undue influence over Grandpa, that he was not of sound mind, and that I had isolated him from the rest of the family. Lies, all of it. But I knew the legal system would give them their day in court anyway. To cope, I sought out the neighbors, many of whom had known Grandpa for decades. Old Mrs. Peabody next door gave me a trembling hug and told me she'd testify if I needed it. She had seen me come day after day, while the rest of the family never showed up. Mr. and Mrs. Gonzalez across the street offered stories of how Grandpa often told them how proud he was of me, how he said I was the only one who still made him smile. Their warmth was a relief in that sea of hostility I faced from my own flesh and blood. During that time, I felt such a tangle of emotions. Anger, sorrow, betrayal. I couldn't believe how quickly people could flip when money or property was on the line. These were the same individuals who had once toasted my birthdays and shared family picnics. I found myself having restless nights, plagued by dreams of Grandpa scolding me for letting the family descend into this madness. But then I'd remember his words and his faith in me, and a quiet determination would settle in my chest. I hired a lawyer who was recommended by Grandpa's own attorney. He was empathetic yet pragmatic. He explained that while the case was on my side, it could still drag on. The family might try to gather any medical records that suggested Grandpa was forgetful, any testimony from unscrupulous people who'd say I'd kept him away from others. We braced for a long, bitter fight. Months crawled by. Court dates were set and rescheduled. Meanwhile, I visited Grandpa's house as often as I could, trying to maintain it in good shape, fixing a broken window, cleaning the dust, watering what remained of the old garden. Each time I walked through those rooms, I felt his presence. I could hear his voice, gentle and reassuring. It drove me to keep going, to push through the emotional weight of battling my own family. Then the day of the first court hearing arrived. I showed up with my lawyer, wearing the black suit Grandpa had bought me for my college graduation. My relatives were already there. Terry with a sneer curling his lip, Aunt Linda clutching a folder of papers, a couple of cousins I barely recognized. Everyone looked tense, as if preparing for a boxing match. The hearing was short, mostly just setting deadlines, but their lawyer immediately launched into an attack on my character. My clients contend that the beneficiary used psychological manipulation, restricting Mr. Irving's contact with his other kin. I felt my blood boiling. That was a blatant fabrication. Afterwards, I could hardly speak. But my lawyer whispered, "Take it one step at a time. The truth is on your side." I tried to believe him. In the weeks that followed, we collected statements from the neighbors, from Grandpa's doctors who confirmed that aside from the physical ailments, Grandpa had a sound mind. We dug up photographs that showed me and Grandpa happily going about our day, along with phone records proving that Grandpa had tried calling other relatives, and they hadn't answered. The process was grueling, but slowly, a mountain of evidence in my favor began to form. My relatives, however, didn't relent. They trotted out distant acquaintances who claimed Grandpa was easily confused, and that I pressured him to sign papers. It was a sickening display of falsehood. Terry even went as far as to produce a statement from someone claiming to be Grandpa's nurse, except Grandpa never had a live-in nurse. It was all contrived. I felt my faith in humanity slipping, seeing how casually people could lie for money. The case dragged on for almost a year. Court appearances, depositions, conflict after conflict. All the while, I balanced my normal life, my job, my attempt at some semblance of a social life, with this never-ending drama. Some nights I'd break down in tears, wondering if I should just give them the house to stop the madness. But then I'd remember the nights Grandpa spent awake, wincing in pain, and how I'd help him walk around the room to ease his aching joints. How he'd look at me with such gratitude. I felt a duty to him, to stand firm. Finally, the day of the decisive court session arrived. We had our final arguments ready. My relative's lawyer repeated the same lines about undue influence, painting a picture of me as some manipulative vulture. My lawyer calmly countered with real documents, medical records, testimonies from neighbors and doctors. The judge asked several pointed questions. I sat there, hands clenched on my lap, heart pounding. All I could think was, "This is for you, Grandpa. I'm doing this for you." Then, after what felt like an eternity, the judge looked over the paperwork, glanced at everyone, and started reading her decision. My chest tightened with every word. She talked about the legal standards for undue influence, about Grandpa's mental competence. Then, with a steady tone, she concluded that the will was valid, that there was no credible evidence that I had manipulated Grandpa or that he was incompetent. She declared that the house was lawfully mine under the will's provisions. A hush fell over the courtroom. I exhaled shakily, tears threatening to spill. Terry cursed under his breath. Aunt Linda looked furious, but I felt only relief mingled with a profound sadness. In a perfect world, we would have come together as a family to mourn Grandpa's passing and honor his wishes. Instead, it turned into a brawl over material gain. Outside the courthouse, I tried to meet Terry's gaze, to see if there was any semblance of remorse or reconciliation. All I saw was anger and resentment. He stormed off, muttering curses. The others followed suit, and that was it. No apology, no admission that they'd been wrong. My lawyer put a reassuring hand on my shoulder and said, "It's over, for now at least. Go home, try to find some peace." When I returned to Grandpa's house that afternoon, the sun was shining brightly, and I half expected to see him sitting on the porch, waving at me. The house was silent as I walked through the door. For a moment, I just stood in the foyer, letting the familiar smell of old wood and faint spices wash over me. I closed my eyes and felt a tear roll down my cheek. "We did it, Grandpa," I whispered. "I kept your wish." I wandered from room to room, running my fingers along the dusty shelves, the framed photos, the furniture I remembered from childhood. Somehow, it felt both triumphant and hollow. I had protected the house, yes, but at the cost of severing ties with most of my family. Perhaps those ties were never strong to begin with, but it still hurt. I found myself in Grandpa's bedroom, which looked untouched since the day I'd tidied it after the funeral. On the nightstand, I noticed a small drawer slightly ajar. I pulled it open and found a handwritten note. It read simply, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. But I knew you'd be the one to find it. Thank you for everything. Love, Grandpa." That was all, but it was enough to make me choke up. In the weeks that followed, life slowly resumed a new kind of normal. I took time off work to begin cleaning and repairing the house properly. Each room held memories. In the kitchen, I recalled helping Grandpa knead dough for bread. In the living room, I remembered holiday gatherings that were happy before the family drifted apart. At the foot of the stairs, I recalled sitting with Grandpa after his knee surgery, making sure he didn't slip as he took each step. I thought about turning the old study into a reading nook or maybe a small library to keep Grandpa's vast collection of books safe. I even contemplated opening part of the house to the public, like a little museum dedicated to the history of our family in the area. But that might be too sentimental or too impractical. For the moment, it was enough just to maintain it as a place of refuge, a place that reminded me what genuine love and care felt like. The family, for the most part, faded from my daily life. A few tried to send me snide messages or demanded money. But after the final judgment, they had little recourse. They had shown their true colors. Even so, a small part of me held onto a sliver of hope that someday they might come around, that we could talk without accusations and bitterness. I doubted it, but I let the hope linger. One afternoon, as I was tending to the small garden in the backyard, I came across an old fruit tree that Grandpa had planted when I was just a child. It was bent and half dead, its branches heavy with unpicked fruit. I decided to clean it up, cutting away the dead limbs and giving it proper care. It felt symbolic, a half-forgotten tree given a second chance to thrive. That night, I sat on the back porch and watched the sunset beyond the fence, thinking about cycles of life, about how families grow and fall apart, how new beginnings can sprout from old roots if tended carefully. For the first time in months, I felt a calm settle over me, a sense that maybe I could find happiness here, carrying on Grandpa's legacy, building something meaningful in the very home he'd cherished. I reminded myself that not all family is defined by blood. Grandpa had taught me that real family is built on love, presence, and genuine concern for each other's well-being. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and I continued restoring what I could. I found letters Grandpa had written to friends long passed away, detailing his pride in me, talking about how the future might look if I inherited the place. Reading his words, I sometimes cried, sometimes laughed. It was like discovering how deeply he had planned for me, how he believed in my potential to keep the house alive. I also found old photo albums in a dusty trunk, filled with pictures of relatives in happier times. There was Aunt Linda beaming at a family reunion 20 years ago, Terry as a boy with a gap-toothed grin. I paused, a wave of regret hitting me. What if things had been different? What if they had been there for Grandpa like I was? Could we have stood together, side by side, celebrating his memory instead of tearing each other apart? I knew those questions had no simple answers. People make their choices and sometimes greed blinds them to what truly matters. Eventually, I made the decision to stay in the house for good. My apartment lease was up, and though commuting would be longer for work, I felt the pull of Grandpa's spirit anchoring me here. So I moved my things in, rearranged the furniture, painted walls that had faded or chipped. In the living room, I hung some of Grandpa's old photographs, letting his presence grace the space. It felt right, as though he were still guiding me. From time to time, I caught a glimpse of neighbors passing by with a friendly wave, or I'd see a kid on a bicycle pause to gaze at the old porch. I'd smile, remembering how Grandpa once told me that a house should have an open heart. Maybe someday, if I had children, they'd get to sit on Grandpa's old porch swing and listen to me tell stories, just as I once listened to him. Of course, the shadow of my relative still lingered in the periphery. I heard through the grapevine that Terry had sunk into debts he couldn't repay, that Aunt Linda was complaining to everyone who'd listen that she'd been cheated. I tried not to dwell on it. My battle with them was over, and I wanted to live my life without their negativity. Occasionally, I'd recall the day I caught Terry in the house, rummaging through Grandpa's letters. I wondered if maybe he had found some old note from Grandpa praising me, something that made him realize the depth of their own neglect. Maybe that's why he left so angrily. But there was no closure with them. I had to create my own closure by honoring what Grandpa would have wanted, to keep the home in the family, to give it care and love. One late autumn day, as the leaves turned golden, I planted a new sapling in the backyard, a young oak tree, sturdy and full of potential. It felt like a declaration of hope, a living symbol of continuity. I knew it would take years to grow strong. But that was the point. Some of the best things in life require patience and faith. I imagined Grandpa watching me from wherever he might be, nodding in approval. That night, before turning off the lights, I lingered in the hallway where so many family photos still hung. I ran my finger along the frames, letting each face pass before my eyes. Grandpa in his youth, proud and smiling. Me, a small child on his lap, looking at him with wide-eyed admiration. So much had happened since those carefree days. Losses, betrayals, heartbreak, and yet also love and resilience. I whispered, "I miss you, Grandpa," into the quiet air. It felt like he was there, in the stillness, telling me I'd done all right. It was in that moment that I truly let myself feel the magnitude of what had transpired. I had faced down the greed of people who should have been my allies, endured months of legal warfare, and emerged with the house intact. But more than that, I had emerged with my sense of self-respect and loyalty to Grandpa preserved. Though it hurt to lose whatever minimal family bond remained, I realized I couldn't hold on to people who valued property more than genuine connections. In a way, the house was a test of love and memory, and only I had passed it. The following morning, I woke early, made coffee, and stood on the front porch, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. I watched the sunrise paint the sky with streaks of pink and orange, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, I felt at peace. This house wasn't just wood and nails. It was the embodiment of Grandpa's spirit, of every laugh and tear we'd shared, every lesson he'd taught me about kindness and perseverance. He had trusted me with it, and I had honored that trust. I felt him near me in that quiet dawn, as though he were saying, "Well done, kiddo." Over time, I began inviting close friends over, turning the lonely space into a warm gathering spot. The echoes of laughter began filling the rooms again. We'd sit around the old dining table, its wood scratched and worn with decades of family meals, and I would catch glimpses of the joyful times gone by. My friends would comment on the cozy charm of the place, the sense of history embedded in every corner. I felt proud and grateful, as if I were keeping Grandpa's legacy alive by populating the home with genuine warmth and love. Sometimes I would share stories about him, how he used to toss me in the air when I was little, how he had this gentle whistle while he worked on carpentry projects in the backyard, how he'd always find a reason to laugh, even when things were tough. My friends listened with keen interest, perhaps seeing in my words the depth of what a grandparent's love could mean. It comforted me to talk about him. It kept him close. Life went on. I learned to stand taller in the aftermath of so much conflict. Work challenges felt easier to manage compared to battling my own family in court. Difficult coworkers or stressful deadlines paled in comparison to the emotional war I'd just survived. I even found that my perspective on people's motives had sharpened. I could sense when someone was being insincere or manipulative more quickly than before. Occasionally, I'd receive a random phone call from a distant relative, usually half apologizing, half angling for money. I maintained a polite but firm stance. The house was off limits. I wasn't going to sell it, nor was I going to give them a share. That chapter was closed. The only thing open was my wish for them to reconnect on a humane level if they ever wanted to talk about Grandpa or the good old days in a genuine way. Usually, After a few minutes of awkward conversation, they'd realized there was no use pressing me further. In quiet moments, I still felt the ache of losing Grandpa, an ache that no legal victory could soothe. But I found solace in the knowledge that I had done right by him. The property was safe, cared for, and filled with the spirit of his memory. Sometimes I'd kneel at the spot where I planted the new oak, check the soil, water it if needed. The sapling stood firm. Tiny buds of leaves would appear, a sign of life sprouting from a place that had seen so much strife. It gave me hope, reminding me that healing is possible even after the harshest storms. One evening, I discovered a stack of Grandpa's old journals hidden in the attic, behind boxes of Christmas decorations. Flipping through them, I saw he had written about everyday things. Weather reports, grocery lists, fleeting thoughts about life. But one entry caught my eye. It was written just a few months before he passed, and it read, "I'm grateful that my grandchild has been so attentive and caring. The others have gone their separate ways, but that's all right. I believe love is something you show, not just something you say. I hope one day they'll understand that too." Reading that, I felt tears in my eyes again. He knew. He understood that the rest of the family was distant, but he didn't hold it against them with bitterness. He simply had faith that love might bring them around eventually. His quiet optimism was something I tried to adopt in my own life. While I doubted any major reconciliation would happen soon, I resolved not to let my heart become bitter. That, I believed, was the final gift Grandpa wanted to give me. The strength to love, without naive expectations, to forgive without forgetting, and to stand firm in what's right. As the seasons changed and the house settled into my stewardship, I felt more at home than I ever had anywhere else. Each room told a story. Each piece of furniture bore the marks of a life well lived. I kept some of Grandpa's favorite things in place. A threadbare armchair in the living room, the old radio that crackled with static, but still played the golden oldies he adored. Sometimes, late at night, I'd turn on that radio and listen, imagining him humming along, tapping his foot. My battle for the house had been won, but the greater victory was intangible. I had kept Grandpa's memory alive, untainted by the greed that had consumed my relatives. The house was no longer just a property. It was a legacy of kindness and unwavering support. It was a home in the truest sense, and that is how I found peace. Standing on that porch at twilight, gazing at the silhouette of the oak sapling in the yard and letting the gentle night air brush against my face. In the quiet of that moment, I heard Grandpa's voice echo in my mind, warm and affectionate, the way he'd say, "Good job, kiddo." I breathed in the night air and softly replied, "Thank you, Grandpa. I promise to keep your home safe." That promise I knew I would carry for the rest of my days.